good to be here tonight. Very different market from the last time I spoke for Aqualand. It was 12 months ago, and we'd just come off the biggest price growth we'd ever recorded here in Australia, certainly here in Sydney as well. So today, we are in a very different market. I think 9 interest rate rises will do that. It has really put a bit of a stop to this incredible price growth we saw. Perhaps not a bad thing. I think one of the things is it is the downturn we almost did have to have, because if we didn't, the median price for Sydney would have hit about 2.5 million. So a lot of affordability problems there if it kept going. Good news is it does look like we are at the peak of inflation now. That means that interest rate rises will hopefully slow down from this point forward. In terms of property, what we have seen is that the month-to-month declines have really slowed down. So the absolute worst decline was seen in June last year. There was a lot of uncertainty in the market at that time. Last month in January, we saw only a really small decline in Sydney. So things do seem to be turning around. We do have population growth back, the economy's back, we've got a really strong employment situation. So there is a lot to be looking forward to in Australia with property. And certainly a lot to be looking forward to here in North Sydney and some of the amazing changes that are taking place. So I'll talk through a lot about the market in North Sydney, but also the incredible investment that's taking place and what that will mean to Aura and the outlook for the market here. In terms of North Sydney now, North Sydney is a very, very successful office market. It's one of the biggest in Australia. It's certainly one of the biggest suburban markets in Australia. It is a very vibrant market during the day, but there was a recognition by council that while it was great during the day, it wasn't much fun at night. And as a result, there has been a lot of plans that have been written. There is a lot of investment that is taking place. So the investment is taking place by government. Obviously, government only has so much money, but by extension, that means there has been also a lot of private investment as well. So I've got lots of information, lots of data on everything that's taking place. In terms of unit prices in North Sydney, you can see here that, like the rest of the market, they have dropped back. We have seen a decline in value since about February, March this year. So pretty much in line with what we've seen in Sydney as a whole, Australia as a whole. We've seen pretty much every market decline. But importantly, long term, the North Sydney apartment market has been a solid performer. So if you have a look there over the past decade, we have seen a 70% increase in value. There is a saying that house prices double every 10 years. It's not true. They don't always. Some periods they do double, other periods they don't. But the fact that the unit market here has reached a 70% increase in 10 years does make it one of the stronger performers when we have a look at apartment markets around Australia. Lots of things that have been driving it. Obviously, population growth. There are a lot of people that are moving to Australia. Sydney is has strong population growth. But also this move to apartment living. So during COVID, things really changed. People didn't like living in apartments. We saw this outpouring to regional areas, out of suburban areas. But what is very clear is that people are moving back, and places like North Sydney, a lot of inner suburban areas are doing really well because they're fun to be in again. There's just lots of great cafes open, there's great restaurants, entertainment is back. So there is really this drawing back of activity. It's not showing up in pricing. You can see their prices have come back, but it's showing up very clearly in rental market. So the rental market in the suburban areas, particularly for apartments, is doing really, really well. North Sydney over the next 13 years, that's the time frame at which the government forecasters look at, 2036. There will be 10,000 new residents in North Sydney, and they'll need around 5,000 new dwellings. So obviously North Sydney it doesn't have much land, and these additional 5,000 households will need to be accommodated in apartments. There really is going to be a lot of housing required. A lot of housing that is really suitable, not for younger people so much, but really for older people. That's the demographic of North Sydney, is for couples without children. And also just that, again, coming back to that medium to high density, we will need to ensure that that's available. Some of the other things around North Sydney, it is very high income. when we compare North Sydney to the rest of Sydney, we do have far more people earning $3,500 per week than the rest of Sydney. So 40% of households are in that income category. So a very wealthy part of wealthy part of Sydney, and then given how wealthy Sydney is, a wealthy part of Australia. So a little bit on the housing outlook for Australia at the moment. So when we talk about housing, we often talk about this direct link between interest rates and pricing, and definitely is a very close relationship. But there are other drivers of pricing, and one of them is population growth, and population growth has well and truly returned to Sydney. We're not losing, people aren't moving to Queensland so much anymore. We did see a lot of movement up to Queensland during the pandemic. International arrivals come back to Sydney. So those two things will create a lot of pressure on housing demand. At the same time, we do have this incredible increase in construction costs. So you can see there on the right-hand side, construction costs have surged. So I'm sure any of you that are doing renovations have probably seen this, or if you're looking to build, it's very, very difficult. And I think one of the really great things about this project is that all the contracts were settled in 2019, 2020, and so as a result, this project is priced quite differently to what is going to come out of the ground over the next few years. So apartments will get more expensive, and already we can see a lot of developers that are having to really increase the cost of their apartments. That will flow through to established housing, and all of these things will create a very different environment in Sydney, particularly the inner suburbs of Sydney over the next decade. So in terms of what's happening in North Sydney, there's two major documents, and if you're really curious, they're available online. They're on the council's website. The first one was this community strategic plan that was put together, and it was a consultation with lots of different groups, government groups, a lot of residents, students, visitors around what North Sydney could potentially look like over the period to 2028. So. There was a real desire to accommodate population growth, changing demographics, but really around making North Sydney highly livable. That was really the number one aim. And when we have a look at suburbs that do well over the long term, there's one thing they all have in common, and that is livability. That if you can walk easily, if you've got good public transport, if you've got a great retail precinct, if there's things to do during the day, during the night, they're the sorts of things that people always seek out. And so suburbs with those characteristics do tend to do well. So what the council was aiming for in doing this strategic plan was to create livability. So not just a suburb that was great to work in, but also great to live in. The second document was a CBD public domain strategy. So that was really narrowing in. So they did a North Sydney kind of like the whole area, looked closely at livability there. And then they did a deep dive. So there's lots and lots of projects that are taking place. There's 19 projects. So if you get a chance tonight or down the track, really good idea to look at the media room down the back. The team at Aqualand have really gone through each of the different projects that are taking place and are showing what's happening in each of them. So it is really interesting to see what's proposed. So really what council are trying to do, they really want to make sure there's lots of open space, lots of recreation, really manage traffic congestion. People don't like fast cars coming past them all the time when they're trying to walk down the street. So a lot of traffic calming that's taking place, making North Sydney a smart city, and making sure that it really can cope with a change in the demographics. So not just students and workers and younger people, but also making it a really good area for older people as well. So again, coming back to that walkability and making it easy for people to get around has been a real focus of the council. The project here, Aura at Aqualand, Aura by Aqualand, is right in the middle of the revitalised North Sydney, and it's really exciting too because it's right near the new train station. So the new train station will be opening across the road, the Victoria Cross Metro line. Again, in that media room, it's got a little train, shows you where it goes and all the different stations. But the metro line is obviously a very, very big infrastructure project New South Wales government has invested in, and Victoria Cross Station is one of the major stations. So already North Sydney is a very easy suburb for people to get around, because public transport is amazing with the ferries and the buses and the train. And this will be a major additional piece of public transport that will really help out. The commercial centre is being revitalised to make it much more fun at night time. So once all the workers are out, there is a real aim to get people in here and really to create a great place for people to be in, and also really concentrating on making it green and leafy. So another thing with livability, people do like green cities, they like trees, they like open space. So that is a real focus in making sure the commercial centre doesn't feel like a high-rise concrete jungle, which is not generally a pleasant place to be walking around. More open space and tree coverage. Some really interesting proposals that are put forward by in both the commercial strategic plans. One of them is for a Sydney Harbour High Line, so a little bit that is in New York, the very famous High Line project. There is a proposal to do that. There's even a major proposal to put a whole big park over Warringah Freeway. So if that happened, it would be pretty amazing for the area, but obviously, a very, very major project. But this is some of the visions and some of the projects that have been costed in terms of making North Sydney quite different to what it has been in the past. There's also an increased focus on arts and lots of events. So hopefully not this busy every weekend, but having lots of really fun things to do on the weekends is also a focus by council. A little bit more on the Victoria Cross Metro Station. It won't just be a train station stuck on its own. There's going to be a lot of retailers, a lot of restaurants, and a lot of things to do around the train station, which will make it a really nice area to be around. Lots of high priority projects. So again, lots of detail here. We've got these tables in the article. Medium priority, and then also some of the public investment that's taking place. And then we've got the private investment. So this public investment is driving private investment. So the 14.5 billion is actually private investment. And these are the major projects. So mix of hotels, a mix of retailing, and also a mix of office projects. So, I think one of the things with government investment, there is only a certain amount of money that government has and only a certain amount of projects they can get in place. It is really important that private investment does come in, and as a result, it is good news that we have seen such interest by the private sector in investing in North Sydney. Just in summary, just to finish off, some of the really great things about what's happening around here. Really good public transport, a lot of livability, a lot of focus on livability for North Sydney, a lot more open space, a lot more tree coverage, and finally a real focus also on creative arts and lots of events. So thanks for that.
It's great to be in front of you all. My name's Peter Esho. I'm the co-founder of an organisation called Wealthy. We're a property investment business. We talk to a lot of investors, and what I want to do tonight is relay some of the themes that we're hearing from investors, particularly at a time like this, where we've seen significant interest rate increases. There's a lot of uncertainty in the market, and I want to share with you what investors are asking and what they're actually doing. This is just a bit of a glimpse of our community. We're a business that has really evolved out of our background from wealth management and investment management. And we're backed by some great partners, and that allows us to go out and really use data and use that data to interpret investment trends. My background was in the stock market a very long time ago. When I was 23 years old, I sat down with my grandmother, who had never been to school. She was married when she was 16, and she said to me, "What do you do?" And I said, "Grandma, I work in the stock market." And she said, "What's that?" And I said, "Like business." She said, "Oh, you have a business, do you?" I said, "No." She said, "Look, have you bought a house yet?" And I said, "No." She said, "Go and buy a house." And Grandma's advice, as simple as it was the best financial advice that I was given in my life. Today we have a community of more than 8,000 investors that read our research, that work with us and our team. And when we help those investors, we're also working with partners like developers and mortgage brokers, and that allows us to see the entire chain. It allows us to see where the interest is, but where the constraints are. And that's some of the feedback that I want to share with you tonight. I tend to focus on macro, the top level, the key drivers, the things that trickle down to impact how my pocket and your pocket is impacted. There's a lot of talk around interest rates at the moment. And tonight in the panel discussion, I'll have an opportunity to explain why I think that is the wrong focus. Interest rates are high. Interest rates have been increased 9 times because the economy is extremely strong. And I think a strong economy and a strong jobs market underpins a real estate market. We have record low unemployment. It's not just in Australia, but it's a trend that we're seeing in the UK, in Europe, in the United States, and it doesn't seem like it's going to change anytime soon. There's a lot of stress among central banks at the moment that this record low unemployment is going to cause wage inflation, and so people with strong jobs and rising incomes are going to need a place to put that money, and that's what we're seeing in our business. We're also seeing developers like Aqualand, for example, that are actually in construction, out of the ground, and we're hearing some of the constraints that they have. A lot of you may know through your work, through your business, through your colleagues, just how expensive everything's become. And that eventually impacts the bricks and mortar that we live in, or we rent out, or we rent ourselves as tenants. One of the last things I want to touch on before we go into our panel is that Australia has always been a migrant story. It continues to become a migrant story, and post-pandemic, we have emerged as one of the most attractive developed markets in the world. And that's going to be an important theme that underpins our real estate investment market. Thank you, and I look forward to sharing insights with you in the panel discussion.
There will be opportunity for Q&A at the end of the night as well, so I'm sure there's quite a few people that would like to ask a few questions, but I'll pose a few to the panel first to get started, and then there'll be about 10 minutes at the end of this evening for Q&A. So obviously very pertinent tonight having a discussion about economics and interest rates with the 9th straight record increase in interest rates as of Tuesday, that the RBA increased by another 0.25%. So first question to Nerida, with that interest rate rise announcement, what's the likely impact on the housing market in the sort of immediate, short-term and long-term future?
Well, it obviously has had a very quick impact on the property market. So Sydney house prices started declining in February. So it was before the rates started increasing. But I think most of us by February knew that things were going to start moving in that direction, moving upwards. I think it has shocked people. You know, the average home loan I think is $600,000. It means the average household is spending an extra $1,000 a month on home loan repayments. So, that's money that has to come from somewhere. It's coming from savings. People are spending down their savings. There's people who are no longer spending on other things. So things that did really well during the pandemic, like boats and really nice cars. People aren't buying those sorts of things. And for property, it has obviously led to a very sharp downturn in pricing. So one of the problems early on when interest rates started rising was really the uncertainty about how high they could go. And now that we're getting towards peak inflation, it's highly likely we did hit a peak in December. A lot of the drivers of inflation are starting to be resolved. It is, at this point, unlikely we'll see more than 1 or 2 more increases. So it's not just me saying that. There's also a really good measure of what's going to happen to interest rates is the ASX cash rate futures index. So basically that's people trading on the fact, or trading on where they think interest rates are going to settle. And at the moment, that index is showing that interest rates or the cash rate will peak at 3.6%. So we're at 3.35 now. That means there'll be 1 more increase. Obviously, that can change. If we get a really bad inflation figure in January, that will start to change. But at this point, the market is pricing in a peak of 3.6. So if that's the case, it is likely that the declines in Sydney will be soon over, and that's certainly showing up in month-to-month pricing data. That in June we saw a 2.5 decline, 2.5% decline in 1 month in Sydney house pricing. In January, we saw it decline by 0.2%. So that rate of decline is really starting to flatten out.
Thanks, Nara. So there you go, head first. One more rise. Oh, no pressure on Nerida, but of course. But yeah, hopefully that's the case, and then we start to see inflation peter out. I certainly have a laugh with my friends when I go to the pub and go, oh my gosh, it's $13 for a beer. What's going to happen next? It's going to be $20, in a year's time. Obviously, hopefully not, but that's probably a good segue into pricing. I might pose a bit of a question to Alex. Could you tell us a bit more about pricing and what you've seen, particularly in the market here in North Sydney, and obviously as it relates to Aura by Aqualand?
Yep. So I think I've obviously monitored the market. I'm no economist, but obviously I've seen exactly what Nara is talking about as well in regards to general real estate from a macro level as well. From a micro perspective, just looking at Aura or discussing Aura specifically, we're in quite a unique position as a business, and we treated this, and this is well before the pandemic as well, so it wasn't like we fell into a pandemic and then we changed our strategy completely. But we were working in a way which is kind of in reverse to what a normal developer does. So usually a developer won't start demolition, won't start excavation, and certainly won't start building until they achieve pre-sales. We commenced the demolition and the excavation of the project over 1.5 years before we actually launched the project as well. So we were well ahead of the game, and by doing so, or in regards to getting started that early, we had to procure all our items quite early as well. So we bypassed the increase in construction prices. So usually when you're selling off a plan or you're pricing a project from the very beginning, what you want to do is set a pricing strategy. You're never going to launch the project and leave it there all the way through at the same price point. Ideally, you want to be selling at a lesser price just to start off with, to get the sales coming through the door, people get to know the project, and then you've got a pricing strategy that every quarter or so, if the world goes in the right direction, then you can incrementally increase all the way through up until completion to achieve your target price or your target revenues at the end of the day. We've been able to do that, so we haven't gone back in price. The other advantage I guess we have in our location here is that due to the increase in the construction costs, and there really isn't that much land being sold around as well, and there aren't that many developers in this current market or in this current cycle that are willing to take a risk and buy a site and try and procure materials for a project at this insane cost, because they've got to build that into their prices. And what that actually does is make the apartments unaffordable, or way out of what the market would actually be able to achieve. So we don't have that competition at the moment, certainly not within North Sydney. Further up Pacific Highway, we do in St Helens, but it's a totally different market there as well. So our closest competitor would be our own project at Blue Under the Bay, which is almost sold out. So once we sell out of that as well, we'll have complete focus on this project. But so far we've been going forward, certainly not backward.
Yeah, good point. And obviously you would have seen the construction price increase in the graph that Nerida put up earlier with an incredibly sharp sort of, it's not even quite a J, it's more a straight up I curve in construction costs. But Aqualand's been quite blessed in terms of the strategy to get this site off the ground before that huge jump in construction costs. I might take a bit of a more macro jump out to Peter. Peter, obviously you deal with buyers from right around the world, particular demographics from South America to Asia, etc., and MENA region. What are you sort of seeing with demographics that are now buying internationally back in Australia, now that borders are open and people can physically come and see projects again?
So about 95% of our business is Latin American clients. They're Latin Americans who have come to Australia as migrants, permanent residents or citizens. There's about 150,000 people in Australia that speak Spanish. There's about another 60,000 Brazilians. A lot of them are concentrated in Sydney. They tend to have high incomes, they work in technology, and they come from countries where wealth has been destroyed by government. So if you have a look at what's happening in Argentina, it's a story of about half a century of wealth destruction because of economic mismanagement, and right around the continent. And they come here and they want to invest, and they don't really care about short-term movements. They think long-term. Very similar to the Eastern investors that come out have traditionally been investing in Australia. I think as Australians, sometimes we don't appreciate how good we have it, the things that we take for granted, like Nerida just spoke about, public planning, policy. These are things that we're used to, but they're things that make our real estate market very attractive. And the investors that have that prism of having experienced something much worse are still investing regardless. It's not just migrants though. Again, I'll go back to jobs. The reason why we are in this position, the reason why interest rates have increased by 9 times is because we have an unemployment rate that has never been, hasn't been at this level for a very long time, since my parents were children. And that is what I believe is the most critical nucleus point for any investor. Start with that. Rates are a response to that, but that is not the story. And so when the jobs market is good, you have to look at what are the risks to real estate. And generally when we have had real estate cycles, many of you may have experienced real estate cycles where the market has come down. Usually in those cycles, the market has come down because the person that's pressured by higher rates has an alternative. There's usually been a lot more supply on the table. This cycle's different. If you go and have a look at building starts came out today. Building permits came out today. We're permitting about 15,000 dwellings a month, 180,000 dwellings a year. For an economy that's about to take in an additional 300,000 or 400,000 migrants, has record low unemployment, has housing stock that's aging, has an aging demographic that needs a different type of housing, and has a lot going for it post-pandemic. So to me, I'm focused on the positives. I'm not living in fairy tale land, but I'm not dwelling on just interest rates.
Yeah, and somebody might have seen the announcements and take them with a grain of salt, because obviously they were election announcements that the Perrottet government committed to build, I think it was millions of houses. I can't quite remember the exact stat. Whether or not that actually realised, yet to be seen, but the market response to that has certainly been noticed in a lot of the work that my organisation does, working with a large range of developers. Again, I might flip it on its head again, but speaking of demographics, Nerida, when demographics move into a new area, particularly from offshore, but also onshore demographics that might be relocating to a city, could you maybe explain to the audience how that might change a property market?
Yeah, I mean, housing, okay, so Sydney does have a housing supply problem. It doesn't build enough homes for the number of people that want to live here. That challenge is going to become more acute over the next few years, and because of this, what's happening with construction costs. So there's not going to be as many homes built as we need. We are going to see more people here. It's been discussed. There are going to be more people moving to Sydney, and a lot of people renting as well. So people, when they move to a city, they tend to rent first. So that already is showing up very, very clearly across Australia. Rents have risen in Sydney by about 20%. This is advertised rents have increased by about 20% over the past 12 months in Sydney. We've got rents that are skyrocketing because of all these people moving here. Those renters are going to want to switch to buyers, and with not enough homes being built, that means that will place a lot of pressure on pricing. So pretty much what Peter was saying, that's going to happen, and it is happening. The other thing too, which I did mention during the presentation, is around construction costs, and the costs of apartments that are being built in the next 2 years are going to be a lot more expensive. So that's going to flow through to pricing for new apartments. It'll flow through to pricing to existing homes. Construction costs won't go backwards. So you saw that slide up that I showed previously. They've gone up 20% in 12 months. They're not going to drop 20%. So that increase is not going to continue. Obviously, we're not going to keep seeing them increase 20% year on year, but it will slow down, but it won't decline. So there has been a resetting of pricing in construction. It means there's going to be a resetting of pricing in new homes that are built that will flow through to existing homes as well.
Right. And speaking of buyers, probably a question for Alex. What type of buyers are you seeing at Ora by Aqualand?
It's a broad mix actually. It was a hard project to market in terms of trying to nail down the demographic of buyers. But it's a broad mix. Obviously, we've got the local clientele that live in surrounding suburbs, anywhere around the Lower North Shore. A lot of buyers from, so we call it the Golden Triangle, going all the way up Pacific Highway, even as far out to the northwest, as well as a substantial number of buyers that come through there. We are, interestingly enough, which I've never actually experienced in the north, getting some buyers coming from the east. I've never experienced that.
Surely that wouldn't happen.
In my time, it's a big no, apparently. I don't think the east will do that. But
in the Golden Triangle.
well, that's right. But so we are finding some buyers are coming through, and they're actually owner-occupiers too, so not necessarily investors from the east purchasing here as well. Funnily enough, Piedmont was a suburb where we had a lot of buyers come from to move in.
Maybe because they're sitting there watching it come out of the ground, thinking they'll make a jump over.
Maybe not from Piedmont, but definitely
True.
from the bridge. But overall, 70% of the buyers to date have been owner-occupiers. Not to say that 30% are investors, but there's about 10 to 15% of those that we categorise as investors at the moment that have not decided whether it will be their permanent place of residence or whether they'll lease it out initially and then move it later on down the track. But it's been a broad mix, and it's all been, I think we've had one offshore sale.
Yeah, and speaking of being, excuse me, an owner-occupier at Aura by Aqualand, what can an owner-occupier or a downsizer or even an upsizer experience from living at the building?
Yep, so flowing on from what I mentioned earlier on about the pricing and I guess the cost of construction. So we did save ourselves by procuring everything quite early, but what that allowed us to do is push the boundaries as well in terms of what we could actually provide to our new homeowners in the building as well. So with Blue at Lavender Bay, we did for the very first time, as part of our hospitality arm, the lifestyle hospitality arm, set up a lifestyle concierge service within the building. In addition to that, we set up our first restaurant and cafe there as well. So if anyone hasn't tried it, Lulu, I won't give you the rest of it, it's all in French, but...
They make great croissants, well. Really, really good croissants.
But it's become, so Lulu's already received a hat, a Michelin hat. Our second venue, also in the city as well, has received a Michelin hat as well, but that will be expanded off into Aura. So that, when you get a chance, if you get a chance before you go or any other day, the ground floor and the podium level will be full of retail. And then the level above that will be an entire level of commercial. And then obviously above that is residential throughout. But the retail levels is, as opposed to building the retail and what you normally see when you're driving through a residential building that's just settling and you've got people moving in, and usually you've got the retail spaces and they've got coverings from the inside because there's no retailers there. And they're actually not there for quite some time, and eventually they get leased out, and in a worst case scenario you get a 7-Eleven in there, and a best case scenario you might get a good cafe. We are actually retaining the retail. It's going to sit under our hospitality group, which is Eddymont Projects, and we're opening up and will be open, if not when the building settles shortly after that. A promenade, a high-end Japanese restaurant. Guys, throw something in if I forget as well. There's an all-day LA-inspired diner, a wine bar, and I'm looking at the development director, and a cafe as well. So they will all be run by our hospitality group, Eddymont as well. So we can ensure that the quality is going to be fantastic, and we're extending that concierge service into Aura as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I might throw out to questions and answers from the room, but before I do throw to the room, we did have one question that was submitted via email prior to the event, which I'll ask the panel. It was specifically a question about price and value growth for 2 and 3 bedroom apartments in North Sydney. And to that end, the question was, can the experts discuss projected property growth on price and value for 2 and 3 bedroom apartments here in North Sydney? Any first thoughts?
Yeah, so again, I'll talk specifically about what we've just experienced most recently. January was, well, what is normally a very dead and quiet month for any real estate agency or any developer trying to sell apartments, because usually you've got the conveyances that have closed up and you've got the agencies that have closed up for an entire month. we had our best month in January that we've had since the day of launch, which was in December 2020. February has the trend for February is actually better than January as well. So what we're finding is that the 2-bedroom apartments are obviously selling well. The 3-bedroom apartments, we always knew they'd be very popular. So we increased the number of 3-bedroom apartments probably in 2019. So initially we had a minimal number of 3 bedrooms, which is what everyone traditionally did. And then what we also did is incorporate 4 bedrooms. So we've got 14 quite large 4 bedrooms, not including the penthouses on the top of the building as well. But we're finding that 4-bedroom sales and 3-bedroom sales have dramatically increased, especially since around about September, October last year. And 2 bedrooms have always been extremely popular. The benefit to what we've got going on at Aura is that the apartments are, and I hate using this word, but there's no other way to describe it, they're oversized. And then people say, what's oversized? Well, you look at the average sizes of apartments. A 2-bedroom is normally 80 to 85, 3-bedroom is normally about 100 to 110, and 4 bedrooms they're far few between, but our 3s are at about an average of 135, sorry, a little bit more than that, and our 2 bedrooms are closer towards 100 square metres internally on average.
And Nerida, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess the first point to make is that North Sydney is obviously a very different suburb from places like North Ryde and Parramatta, Pyrmont, Ultima. You know, those are the areas we do see a lot of demand for smaller apartments. There's a lot of students. You need cheaper apartments, but North Sydney isn't like that. We don't see a lot of there's a lot of students, but it's not a student market as such. Also, it's very wealthy. If you have a look at the demographics, it is a very wealthy suburb. And also, too, the changes in the way that people are living are quite profound in the inner suburbs of Sydney. Trying to get a family home on a single block is very difficult. It may, you know, there's heritage overlays to try and change homes and make them livable. Also, the things that downsizers want are quite different. The downsizers don't typically want to downsize from a big family home to a 2-bedroom tiny apartment. They want to downsize to something that's pretty comparable to what they were living in, but they can lock it up and they can put their car in the garage and they can go overseas and do other things, or head down the coast, or wherever they've perhaps got a second home, and that's a type of buyer too that is very prominent in certainly in a project like this, but also prominent in beautiful suburbs like North Sydney. Once this inflation issue is under control, then it will be quite a different economy. As to when, I mean, I don't know for sure. I do think they'll start to flatten out this year, and then if the economy, if I suppose worst case, they've gone too hard. I mean, too hard, too quick. They shut down the economy. They're going to have to reverse it really, really quickly. So that is worst case. You know, Australia's in a very different economic position to say the UK at the moment. With even New Zealand, looking at New Zealand data now is looking pretty shonky because they have increased rates too quickly. But in Australia, yeah, I think particularly if we start to see rising unemployment, that will be worrying the Reserve Bank. As Peter mentioned, we are at a 50-year low with unemployment, so it's still pretty tight. Or people dramatically stop spending, or we start to see not signs of recession, but of a dramatic slowdown. At that point, they'll start to reduce them. I think for property, anyone with property and with I've got a mortgage, I'd love them to come down pretty quickly. That would make my life a lot easier. But I think at this point, hope for them flattening out first quarter. Hopefully by April, I think we'll probably hit a peak, and then at that point, stabilisation, and then perhaps end of this year we might see them start to decline a bit.
Thanks, Nerida. Hopefully that answered your question.
It's an important part of what we do in terms of sustainability, everything you just touched on as well, but it's also a requirement by the council as well. So even if we didn't want to go down that path, you're kind of forced to go down that path anyway, which is actually a good thing. And it's also inevitable that we're going to need to do that anyway. So one example is, and we actually had a meeting on it yesterday, in-depth meeting about the EV charging stations that will be required downstairs. So as opposed to just building a building and letting the corporate or the owners have to front the costs of having to install all the requirements for the charging stations later on down the track. So we've provisioned, I think it's around about 33 to 40% of the car spaces downstairs. So should anyone have an EV, it's literally a case of just installing the EV, or whether it's the Tesla or whatever it might be. It's easily done from that point as well. In terms of the facade itself, there's a lot of science behind it. Again, I'm not a development director. I know he goes through it daily with the design and construction team, but the requirements that go into the selection of the actual facade, the type of glass, the reflectivity, the amount of sun that comes through, the UV protection, it's an insane amount of data that goes behind it, and the procurement of that, again, like we were starting to find, the procurement of that was actually quite intense. In terms of the air conditioning, again, we're limited in the amount of wattage, we're limited in the amount of airflow and all that kind of stuff, but again, we've got to finally balance that with making it very efficient and comfortable for owners as well. So we've been able to do that. We worked on that for about 3.5 years before we actually launched the project as well. But to answer the question in simple, it is a requirement by council, but at the same time, it's an important factor for us as well.
Thank you. Any more questions from the audience? Okay, well, if there's no more questions, that wraps up the formal part of the evening.